That's been the arrangement since the 1970s when America secured agreements with Gulf states to price oil in dollars and recycle those dollars back into U.S. financial markets. Countries need dollars to buy oil, which creates constant global demand for the dollar, which lets America borrow cheaply, run deficits, and hold its dominant financial position. This system is called the petrodollar, and it is one of the core pillars of American economic power. Not military power, economic power, the kind that doesn't need a single soldier on the ground. Now, what happens when the Strait of Hormuz stays disrupted? Gulf states can't export oil efficiently. Petrodollar flows slow down. Dollars stop cycling back into American financial markets at the same rate. And countries around the world start asking a very uncomfortable question. Do we actually need to keep doing this in dollars? China has spent years quietly building the infrastructure to answer that question with a no. The pro-UN system, where oil trades settle in Chinese currency. Payment networks tied to its belt and road infrastructure across 60 countries. Energy agreements with Russia, Iran, and several African nations that deliberately settle in non-dollar currencies. The M-Bridge project, a cross-border digital payment system built specifically to move money between countries without touching the US dollar system at all. In a stable world, those systems are background noise. Nobody switches away from a system that works. But in a disrupted world, a world where the old system feels unreliable, where oil shipments are stuck and supply chains are breaking, alternatives start looking very attractive. Finance ministers in countries that have never questioned the dollar start having different conversations. Every week this situation drags on. China's alternative infrastructure becomes more relevant, and the dollar-based order loses a little more of its grip. China didn't cause this crisis, but it absolutely understands what a prolonged crisis does to the system it's been working to replace for 20 years. At this point, some of you are thinking, okay, but doesn't this hurt China too? Energy prices go up, supply chains tighten, Chinese factories and consumers feel the squeeze. Yes, in the short term it does hurt. But here's the critical difference between China and almost every other major economy right now. China planned for this. Over the past decade, China built some of the largest strategic petroleum reserves on Earth, enough to cover months of national consumption without a single tanker moving. It signed long-term energy deals with Russia, Central Asia, and African producers specifically to reduce how much it depends on Gulf shipping lanes. It built the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a massive infrastructure project that gives China direct land access to the Arabian Sea without going anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz. It invested heavily in overland pipeline routes with Russia and Central Asia that move energy across land, not sea. And on top of all that, China is now the world's largest producer of solar panels, electric vehicles, and battery storage technology. It manufactures more renewable energy equipment than the rest of the world combined. Its domestic clean energy capacity has grown faster than any major economy in history. This is not climate policy. This is strategic independence built deliberately over 2 decades to reduce the exact vulnerability that the Strait of Hormuz blockade is supposed to create. China just blocked the United States at the United Nations, and the reason why will completely change how you see this war. On April 7, 2026, inside the United Nations Security Council, a resolution came to a vote. The goal on paper was simple: reopen the Strait of Hormuz, end the blockade, restore global oil flow. 11 countries said yes. China and Russia said no. And within minutes, Western headlines had their story. China protects Iran. Russia shields a rogue regime. 2 powers choose chaos over stability. But that story, it's missing the most important part. And once you see what's actually happening beneath the surface, you won't look at this conflict the same way again. If you follow geopolitics and you want analysis that actually goes deeper than the headlines, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down what the news skips. Here's the one question nobody in mainstream media is asking. China, according to trade data, buys more Iranian oil than almost any country on Earth. A huge chunk of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. If that route stays blocked, China bleeds economically every single day. So why would China stop the resolution that claims to fix the very problem hurting China the most? Think about that for a second. Because the moment you answer it honestly, the whole picture shifts. This wasn't China protecting Iran. This was China protecting itself from something far bigger and far more dangerous than a blocked waterway. Let's go back to that resolution, because what most people don't know is that this document went through multiple rewrites before the vote ever happened. The original draft was aggressive. It used the phrase "all necessary means," diplomatic language for military forces authorized. Any country could have used that resolution as legal cover to send warships into the region and engage Iranian forces directly. It also invoked Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is the clause that allows the Security Council to authorize military action. That's not a technicality. That's the difference between a strongly worded letter and a green light for war. Multiple countries pushed back hard. France, Russia, China all said it went too far. So, the language was softened, then softened again. The Chapter 7 language was stripped. The all necessary means phrase was removed. By the final vote, the text had been cut down to something that only encouraged defensive coordination among naval escorts, and China still said no. Now ask yourself, if China's goal was simply to protect Iran, why negotiate at all? Why sit through days of consultations? Why push for revisions? Why not just veto version 1 and walk away? Because that's not what was happening. China wasn't protecting Iran. China was blocking the United States from doing something far more significant: getting United Nations legal cover to reassert military control over the world's most critical oil route. And if you understand why that matters, everything else clicks. Here's something Chinese military strategists have discussed for decades. They even gave it a name: the Malacca Dilemma. The idea is this: the US Navy controls the key maritime routes that Chinese oil travels through: the Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean corridors. At any point in any serious conflict, America could choke China's energy supply simply by controlling those choke points. No missiles needed, no invasion, just naval presence at the right places. China has never been able to fully solve that problem. Its navy has grown enormously in the past 20 years, but it still cannot match American reach across every critical waterway simultaneously. Now imagine the United States goes to the UN, gets international approval, sends forces into the Strait of Hormuz, reopens it by force, and walks away looking like the world's energy protector. Every news channel on Earth runs the story. America saved the oil. America kept the lights on. What just happened? America proved in front of the entire world that it still controls who gets energy and who doesn't, that the most critical oil route on the planet runs through American-authorized military power. And every country that depends on that route, including China, just watched a live demonstration of exactly how dependent they still are. For China, that outcome isn't just bad. It's a strategic nightmare that sets back decades of work to reduce that exact dependency. So, China didn't veto because it wanted the strait closed. It vetoed because it could not allow the United States to be the one that opened it. Now, here's where this goes from a regional conflict to something that affects every person watching this. The global oil trade runs on US dollars. While Europe scrambles to replace disrupted energy supplies, and America's Asian allies sit exposed to price shocks with no real backup plan, China is absorbing this disruption from a position it spent 20 years building toward. The blockade is a problem for everyone, but it is a bigger problem for China's rivals than it is for China. There's one more dimension here that almost no one is covering, and it might be the most important one long-term. Inside the Security Council chamber, China's ambassador said the resolution didn't address root causes, that military strikes were launched against Iran first, that a resolution authorizing further force in response to a country now defending itself sets a dangerous legal precedent for how powerful nations justify military action going forward. Whether you agree with that framing or not, a huge part of the world does agree with it. Across Africa, Latin America, and large parts of Asia, there is deep skepticism toward the pattern of Western military action followed by UN authorization. Countries that lived through Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan have long memories. Many of these nations have watched this cycle repeat for decades: military strikes first, international legal cover second. And when China stands up in that chamber and vetoes, they don't see obstruction. They see someone finally saying no to a pattern they've long felt was built for someone else's benefit. This gives China something money can't buy: moral positioning in front of the global South, the fastest growing bloc of nations on Earth. The countries that will define the next 50 years of geopolitical alignment, trade relationships, and resource deals. China didn't fire a shot. It didn't spend a dollar on weapons. It didn't deploy a single soldier. And yet it walked out of that Security Council chamber, having blocked US military legitimacy, kept pressure on the dollar system, activated its alternative financial infrastructure, and strengthened its standing across the developing world, all with one vote. Here's the part most analysts are ignoring. The United States now has a choice that has no clean answer. Option 1. Go ahead without UN authorization. Build a naval coalition, send warships into the strait, force it open by military pressure alone. That is legally and diplomatically messier than it sounds. Several US allies, including France and Germany, have already signaled they will not participate in enforcement operations. Japan and South Korea are watching their energy costs explode, but are not ready to join a military operation that lacks UN backing. Acting without the UN doesn't just look unilateral. In front of the global South audience we just discussed, it proves China's argument for them. Option 2. Keep negotiating at the UN. But China and Russia have already signaled they plan to submit a counterproposal built around a ceasefire and diplomacy. Every day that drags on, the blockade continues and the economic pressure on US allies grows. Option 3. A bilateral deal with Iran. Some back-channel reports suggest quiet conversations are happening. But any deal that looks like America blinked after threatening to destroy Iran would carry enormous political costs domestically and signal something very uncomfortable to every adversary watching. There is no path forward that is free. And that pressure, that trapped feeling, is exactly the strategic position China just helped create with one veto. This is what the transition from a one-power world to a multi-power world actually looks like. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a declaration or a speech. It comes in moments like April 7, 2026. A vote that looked procedural but was anything but. The United States went to the United Nations asking for something it once could have expected automatically. And two major powers looked across the table and said, "No, that doesn't mean America is finished. It doesn't mean China wins everything from here. History is not that simple. And none of this is settled. But it does mean the rules of the game have changed. And if you don't understand how, you will keep misreading every major event that follows." If this gave you a different way of seeing what's happening, share it with one person who only reads headlines, because the gap between the headline and the reality right now is enormous. And if you want to keep getting this kind of breakdown, subscribe. New video drops this week on what Iran actually gains from keeping the strait closed.